As you're learning how to code, you'll eventually run into different dev tools, and you'll start to wonder which of these dev tools is right for me, or which ones should I be focusing on. And what I mean by dev tools, I'm referring to tools like Terminal or your IDEs like Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, Eclipse, and different types of IDEs, or maybe you're wondering how to use Git. So these are all different dev tools that will help you in your development to help you write better code and be efficient in your development. When I was at my first company, a coworker came into my office and he was telling me about how his main development tool was Terminal. Now, in university, that was my main development tool, but that was because I didn't really learn about IDEs at that point. And so I did all of my development in my terminal. I would compile my code there, I would edit my code in a terminal-based code editor like Emacs or Vim or VI. So that's all I knew about Terminal. But he was showing me that you can actually do a lot of different things. And he was kind of making the case that real developers use Terminal and they just only use Terminal. And he was bragging about how you wouldn't have to use a mouse. You can open up different windows in Terminal. You can also use different aliases and make your Git commands a lot faster. And so he was showing me all of these cool things. And I did take some of the things that he taught me, and I tried using it in my development environment and in my development workflow. And some of it did work, but I also ran into some difficulties. In this video, I'll be sharing about those difficulties and how to go about finding the right tools for your coding development environment. And then I'll be sharing about some general principles that I've learned over the years for how we should think about dev tools so that we don't waste time with them, but use them effectively to develop and generate better code for our projects. So my name's Henrik, and I'm here to help you learn the foundations of software development. So let's get started. Alright, going back to that story about my coworker, one of the things he taught me was about Git aliases. And so he told me that you could actually assign different special Git commands for some common Git commands. So you don't have to type in git commit. You could actually just type gc, or you could type git ci. So you could just type whatever alias you want. And that supposedly is going to make it easier for your development, right? But my problem was that I would set these up, but then eventually I would forget what aliases I was setting up. So I wouldn't remember if GC stood for git commit or if it stood for git clone. And so I had a hard time remembering my own aliases. So that was one of the first things. Another thing that I tried doing was I tried to have my own bash functions. So I would have these functions to run some common Git commands, or maybe I wanted to make my terminal window look prettier. So I would have these bash functions that would execute right as soon as I opened up bash. And so I would have these different functions, but the problem was sometimes the functions wouldn't work correctly. So one of the functions I created was to do a git checkout of master, git pull to get the latest master, and then I did a git checkout to go back to my original branch, and then I would have that function do a rebase so that we would rebase on that master branch, and then I would do another command to push. After that rebase worked, I would push those changes to the remote repository. And so that's a nice function to have because you can easily rebase your branch off of master. And that was something that I did frequently. So I wanted to create a function for that. But eventually a lot of times what happened was I would have a merge conflict. And so when those merge conflicts come, that function doesn't work properly anymore. So then I have to do more adjusting of that function, and eventually I would have all of these functions, but they wouldn't work correctly, or I would have to do some patchwork on them so that they would work correctly. And so now I'm spending more time focusing on my bash functions than my actual functions in my actual code. So that took up a lot of maintenance time, but on top of that, something that I soon realized in working in a company is that I would often have to work on different machines. So I wasn't only doing development on my own personal or my own corporate laptop or my own corporate desktop, but I was also having to do development on different laptops in different labs. So in my first and my second company, we have different labs and we have different machines that we're doing development on. And it can be a hassle to make sure that every machine has your development environment. And so, for example, with the Git aliases and all of those bash functions, I would have to make sure that those bash functions would be able to be used in my setup in the lab. And over time, you realize you're not also you're not always going to be working on the same computer that you were working on before. Sometimes you have to get moved to another computer in the lab, and because there are different setups in the lab. And so it's not practical to keep porting your development environment in every different machine. And on top of that, sometimes you have a dev tool that you really like to use in your laptop, but you need to have IT install that same dev tool in another machine. And so that causes a lot of friction in your development. And so what I've opted to do is, instead of trying to make sure that I use instead of trying to make sure that my dev tool is installed on those computers, I look at what's already pre-installed in those computers, because other programmers, other developers have coded on those machines also. So I just look for what are the installed dev tools that are already there, and I would just use those dev tools instead. And so, for example, when it comes to like looking at your code and doing a search like through all of the functions in a code base, I noticed that Notepad++ was always installed in all of our computers. So I would often use that as my go-to for searching a code base. If I really just wanted to do a quick check on my code base, see where a function is used, then I would just use Notepad++ because I know that that's always there and I'm familiar with it. But of course, if it's not there, then I have to adapt and make sure that I'm able to pick up another code editor to do a search on that code base. So here's a general principle to keep in mind when it comes to using your DevTools. You don't want to be spending too much time setting up your DevTools every time, or maybe debugging something that's not working properly in your DevTools. You want to make sure you avoid that and make sure that you're spending more time debugging your actual code. So when I was working at my company, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't spending the whole day debugging these different tools that I was using. I want to make sure I'm spending most of my day focusing on the actual task that I was assigned for my project. Another helpful principle about DevTools is you want to focus less on chasing that perfect setup and focus more on adaptability. And what I mean by adaptability is just this idea that you're able to develop on any machine. There's going to be a lot of instances where maybe your IDE has a software update and then it needs to be updated, or maybe there's some bug in your IDE, or maybe some bug in your dev tool, and then you need IT to fix it for you. You don't want to be caught unproductive during that moment. Or maybe you're assigned to a computer in the lab. You don't want to be caught unproductive when you go to that computer and you can't develop because you don't have your perfect setup with you. You want to be able to see what are the dev tools that are on that machine already and be able to do development right away. Because there's going to be other developers who have coded in that computer too, and so you just work with the dev tools that are available there. For example, when it comes to diff tools, a lot of times I don't really care what the diff tool is. I just want to be able to do the diff. So focus more on those principles, those general principles, and then that's how you can be adaptable, because you don't have to use your perfect diff tool in order to do a diff. You can just be mindful of what are the diff tools out there that are available, and then you can do your diff that way. Speaking of adaptability, when you're working in a professional setting, you'll realize that you can't use the same setup all the time. Sometimes you have to use the setup that your team is using. So oftentimes I've worked on different projects. In my first company, we were a research company. So every time I was on a new project, I would have a new dev environment that my team wanted me to use. So maybe they would want me to use Eclipse, and then I would have to do my development in Eclipse because our software would need to use Eclipse. Or sometimes we have to use Visual Studio for another product, and so I would have to switch to, I wouldn't be able to use Eclipse anymore. I would have to use Visual Studio at that time. And then maybe you're going to use different IDEs, or maybe, for example, in another project that I was moved to, I had to do Android development. So I had to use Android Studio, and sometimes I had to use Eclipse for those Android applications. And so in what I've noticed, maybe it's just my career, but no matter, depending on the project, sometimes your environment will have to change. And even in my current job, I'm not in research anymore. We're doing product development, but now we have to use different IDEs for different code bases that we're using. And so even in my current company, even though we have different code bases, we're going to have to switch from one development environment to another, and then you have to keep in mind the general principles of those dev tools as you move to different IDEs. So what I noticed about these different IDEs, I used Eclipse, I used Visual Studio, I used Android Studio, I used different flavors of Eclipse. But what I noticed about all of these different IDEs is that they have a lot of things in common, and this is what you need to think about as a developer. So when you look at these IDEs, they usually have a terminal that you can use. They usually have a debugger that you can use. They have a call stack that you can look at. They have a watch window so you can see your variables, and then the file explorer. So you just have to keep in mind these general principles. So this is how you become adaptable. You keep in mind these general principles. So no matter what IDE your team wants you to use, you can already be productive with that IDE because you already know the general principles. So the trick I want to impart to you in this video when it comes to dev tools is you want to be adaptable. And in order to be adaptable, you need to follow the underlying pattern when it comes to software development. So as a developer, what do you really need? First, you need an IDE. So when it comes to an IDE, don't focus so much on perfecting or mastering or getting the best IDE. You just want the IDE that you're going to use for your code base. And then you just want to know the underlying patterns, like the debugger, how to use a debugger, how to navigate files in your IDE, how to use a terminal in your IDE. So that's one, the IDE. And then, of course, version control. So you want to know the basics of Git. And thankfully, Git is pretty portable. You can use it anywhere. But don't focus so much on how to get Git working with your IDE. You don't really need to care about that. You can just focus on the terminal commands. Those are always tried and true. Like those Git commands in terminal are always going to be there no matter what machine you're going to use. So master that. So use your Git. That's something that every developer needs. And when it comes to Git is helpful because you can have different versions of code and it helps you find bugs easier. And in order to do that, to find the bug, you need a diffing tool. So that's another underlying pattern that you need to think about as a developer. Just thinking about, you need a diff tool to be able to compare your code. So compare one version of your code to the second version of your code. You need a diff tool for that. Or maybe you want to collect logs from your program. So you need a diff tool for that to see what the difference is between running your code with this code versus that code. So you want to have a diff tool. So these are some underlying patterns that you should focus on when it comes to software development. So it's not your dev tool setup that makes you fast and efficient when it comes to coding. What really makes you fast and efficient is your adaptability, being able to know what's really happening in the code development process. And so here's something to think about. Say your computer were to die right now and you lost your whole setup. Would you be able to, if you were given a new computer, would you be able to quickly and efficiently be able to code productively with that new computer? Or would you be wasting all of your time trying to get all of your tools back in place and then you can start your development? If you're just starting off in your programming journey and you don't know where to start, you can download my 30-day beginner coding challenge. And it's a 30-day guide where I teach you how to build those 4 beginner programming projects. It's really beginner friendly and I go step by step on how to build each one and I go through the tutorials that you need to build each one. So download that in the link in the description. Alright, that's it for this week's video. I hope it really helped you out, and if it did help you out, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And I hope it just gave you some encouragement that you don't need to spend too much time perfecting your dev tool or spend so much time finding the right dev tools, finding the right extensions for your IDE. You don't need to worry about all of that. All you need to focus on is the general principles when it comes to software development, and then focus most importantly on your actual programming language. Focus on writing better code, focus on fixing your bugs, ironing out those bugs, those inefficiencies, and that's how you can become a better developer. And if you want to watch other DevTool videos, I have a lot of DevTool videos. You can watch this one over here, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.